Good afternoon. I'm glad you can join me for a somewhat fascinating, but I think the only word that I can use is really overwhelming topic when you think about the environment, how it affects us, and how it affects our patients. So this afternoon, I'm going to take 8 hours of material, stuff we've been reading about and writing about, and try to synthesize it, for a 45-minute presentation. I'm really just going to focus on a few topics: lead, copper, pesticides, insecticides, and I'm going to end with the environmental screen issues, TV and screens, and how it affects psychiatric disorders in kids. So let's get started. I'm going to really start talking about lead. And certainly we've known for many years the brain sensitivity to lead and children's brains, certainly as the brain is developing through adolescence, and the whole neurotransmitter systems we know are developing through our late 20s. So most of the current wave of interest in lead, even though we've been looking at it for 100 years, is with the Flint, Michigan crisis and the tremendous concerns with the water. And here you see first in 2014, the city of Flint changed its water supply, and what happened was really a public health nightmare and quite disastrous to young children and families in Michigan. Part of the initial testing was looking at 1,400 kids under 5 living in Flint, with certainly very significant elevations here in lead. And if you can see the pre and the post, lead exposure was over 6% increase. I think, the Flint crisis precipitated states around the country to start looking at water supply, certainly in the school systems, and to bring it home here, where I'm from in Massachusetts. The Flint, Michigan crisis got the Mass Department of Environmental Protection to spend $2 million sampling schools in and around Massachusetts. And high lead levels were found in 160 Mass schools. And that was the headline. We'll talk about copper and other contaminants, but certainly lead was found. Here you see these are towns around Boston area, suburbs that we would be sending our kids to school in. I have friends in many of these towns, and if you look at the lead levels, all being elevated in this sample. Of the 1,000 schools that were voluntarily tested, you see 995 had at least one sample with detectable lead, and 605 schools had one sample above the state's kind of regulatory limit for lead. So just to be dramatic, 995 had detectable lead. We're going to talk in a minute about there's really no safe level of lead. And again, routine screening in the water, which was tested in Massachusetts, looked at the cooking water in the kitchen as well as the water fountain. And here you see lead, and then the beginning of, which I'm going to talk in a little bit about the copper. You see the elevations of lead. Lead only was 35.7%, and then look at the lead and copper elevations, 22.7%, and then copper only. less than half the schools passed. And again, these were levels detected as safe by the Environmental Protection Agency. But you see here, the American Academy of Pediatrics is continuing to recommend lower levels amounts of lead. As I said earlier, our safe limits of lead are getting lower and lower to what you'll see is no lead limits are safe. And these were experiments on animals and being able to calculate what we considered safe levels by the CDC and OSHA can cause profound disturbance in neurotransmitters in animal studies. These are some of the studies looking at kids and behavior. Here you see 150 kids from Michigan, 8 to 17 years of age. Excuse me, this was before the Flint, Michigan crisis. And here, in those days, we were talking about under 5 as the low range, higher blood levels, the ADHD kids, and the direct correlation between lead levels and symptoms of ADHD. There's a computerized test called the Continuous Performance Test, and this is a computerized test where we ask children and adolescents, and we do this on adults, to hit the space bar as they're watching a screen. And it's been normed and used for many years, and there are measures of inattention as impulsivity. So omission errors and commission errors. How quickly do these kids respond and how slow they might respond. And here, measuring the standardized continuous performance test, you see ADHD kids with lead had much higher CPT abnormalities. Further studies, I put this in because it was 2016. So this was last year, looking at over 2,000 kids, 7 to 9, who did not have ADHD, and they were followed for 2 years, and 5%, which is about average, kids developed ADHD. And those risk symptoms increased with increasing blood levels, even at low concentrations. But again, here, pretty dramatic, levels above 2.17, 155% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. So again, 155% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD with lead levels that the CDC would consider, quote, normal. And this is a study in Mexico, again, 2016. Recently, Mexican children aged 6 to 13, blood levels positively associated with ADHD symptoms of hyperactivity. It was actually Children's Hospital in Boston that did a lot of the early work on the low lead levels and essentially no safe levels. They've been advocate as we've been lowering the safe limits of lead to 10 when I was in training, down to 5, and it's pretty clear that any levels are considered neurodevelopmentally toxic with significant implications. And we've looked at these implications. So these are a couple studies that followed individuals over 10, and I think the next study looks at 40 years. So here we have 157 kids, blood levels measured across the first 6.5 years of life. Let's see if I have, so sorry, it's hard to read. So these were MRIs that were done when they were between 19 and 24. And there was significant brain volume loss, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex being associated with what we describe as executive function, impulse control, fine motor control. And those that had the highest exposure to lead had the most significant brain volume loss in adulthood. The next study, which is even more dramatic, looked at lead exposure, and they followed a group of children from New Zealand for over 4 decades. So for 40 years, and those with higher lead exposure in childhood had lower IQ scores. So what we're finding is that lead exposure in early childhood having significant implications almost 4 decades later. And the implications of lower IQ scores are quite significant. Here, just comparing the IQ loss attributable to lead exceeds that of brain tumors, heart disease, and traumatic brain injury. But what this study demonstrated, again, recently published in 2017, looked at a 40-year exposure. When it started, there was more lead in the environment, but there's major implications for long-term IQ, and then the study goes into details about how IQ affects socioeconomic status, quality of life, and a number of other very kind of significant findings. Again, the IQ drop for someone who's, a genius score is not going to be as significant as someone who's kind of borderline or average. So, lead has been looked at for many, many years. The more we look at it, the more significant. We're worried about any exposure. The implications over short-term and long-term are clear. The Flint, Michigan crisis kind of put it on the map for the community as an ongoing public health issue. And we need to be vigilant in our communities, our school systems, to make sure we're looking at lead levels, and we're continuing to treat and test our children. So mercury is certainly another environmental toxin that has profound implications for brain health. There's been a number of articles. Dr. Shaw has written a couple of very nice ones as to kind of the reason humans are more sensitive to environmental toxins than most other animals. And part of that has to do with high fat concentrations in the human brain, high amount of sulfur in the human brain, and both the size and the metabolic activity. So environmental toxins tend to affect both the human brain as well as some of our kind of whale and dolphin friends because of similar high fat and sulfur content. The fat and sulfur tends to bind these toxins and they accumulate in the brain. So mercury is much easier to kind of identify. Certainly, so much now is stored in our environment in our fish, and these are the larger fish that we see elevated levels a lot. The issue is both prenatal mercury exposure with warnings of mothers not to have tuna fish. We certainly don't warn our children, but mercury measured in maternal hair during pregnancy, levels at very small amounts increase risk for ADHD, both inattention and more dramatic for hyperactivity, almost a 70% increase for 0.5 micrograms of mercury increase. So I think part of the issue is what do we do? This is just one of many studies. Again, I put it in because it's 2016, looking at fish consumption. So 1,100 adults were asked about fish consumption in childhood. And those who ate fish several times a week had a 5 and 0.2% higher odds of ADHD compared to the non-fish consumers, and also more likely to have difficulty paying attention at school. So, the question is, what do you do? We're told our fish is healthy. Omega-3s are critically important for brain development. Research looking at treating ADHD, preventing depression and anxiety disorders. And do we ask our children to eat fish, or do we limit our fish based on this and other studies? I think that, in my opinion, I'm much more likely to recommend limiting some of the large fish that we mentioned earlier. So that would be the larger tunas, shark, mackerel, tilefish, and swordfish, and particularly limiting the amount of cans of tuna fish, because we see elevated mercury a lot. Our fish oil supplements, where we try to tell our patients that you can get your food, your nutrients from your food. Fish oil supplements are actually higher quality ones, are molecularly distilled. The PCBs and the heavy metals are removed. So oftentimes fish oil supplementation is a healthier option. I would never tell a child or a family not to eat fish. I would focus on limiting to the smaller fish and not consuming every day. We typically test mercury, particularly is easy with the hair test. Hair tests are relatively inexpensive and easy. I think the next slide, toxic elements maybe 200 to 300 times more concentrated in the hair, and hair mercury is an excellent indicator of total body exposure. The sample of the Great Plains hair test is not an example of elevated mercury, but it's been really an accurate measure for us of copper, certainly, and lead and mercury. The question that we're all asking is, what do we do if our patients, we find elevated levels? Certainly for lead and mercury, we have chelation. Lead is pretty standard protocols in pediatric and children's hospitals. I'm also recommending vitamin C, OPCs, chlorella, lipoic acid, milk thistle are all very important. Lipoic acid and milk thistle to make sure our liver is working optimally, and some research looking at chlorella, OPCs, and vitamin C binding some of these heavy metals. Saunas, research is kind of iffy in terms of the kind of sauna. Infrared saunas, you can stay in longer and stimulate much, for many people, longer sweat. But we do eliminate many of these toxic substances via a sweat. And there's been some protocols, certainly some good protocols following a 9/11 with lots of environmental exposures from the building collapse, and many psychiatric as well as physical symptoms improving with sauna protocol. Again, the longer you can stay in the sauna and the more sweat, the easier it's going to be to eliminate many of these heavy metals. You want to make sure that you're kind of wiping the sweat so your body doesn't reabsorb the heavy metals. For those that don't have infrared saunas or not access to it, any sauna where one is sweating is likely you'll eliminate. You just might not be able to stay in the sauna as long because of the high heat. I want to jump to copper. I mentioned it early on in the water supply. Certainly it has an important trace mineral for many roles in the human body, both in the immune system, regulating metabolism, parts of red blood cell, brain hormone function, but and neurotransmitter synthesis. Here you see copper is required for dopamine beta hydroxylase to synthesize norepinephrine from dopamine. But our elevations of copper due to our environmental toxins, mostly due to the massive copper pipe infrastructure throughout our country, creates both physical and psychological symptoms. We've talked about this before. The physical symptoms are everything from significant damage to kidneys, to hypoglycemia, headaches, increased heart rate, and anemia. The psychological symptoms are quite broad. We've seen everything from fatigue to actually paranoia and psychosis. So elevated copper has profound psychological and physical symptoms. Again, copper creates this abnormal kind of dopamine molecule. It binds to dopamine, creating this abnormal metabolite, as well as sometimes stimulating too much norepinephrine, creating this agitated, irritable, hyperactive site. Excess copper is one of the common reasons I see side effects to stimulants. Very often, patients who've not, ADHD kids who've not tolerated stimulants have elevated copper. As soon as we bring down the copper, we'll talk about that in a minute, but mostly with zinc, we can use stimulants if that's needed down the road. Again, cause of excess copper are drinking water being the most common. Prescription medications, birth control pills, and excess estrogen, either in the environment or in hormones, can cause excess copper. But the other kind of more common thing that we see, particularly in our ADHD kids, is that zinc-copper seesaw going back and forth. So zinc and manganese deficiency can actually cause this accumulation of copper. So we can have elevated copper in the water supply at a particular home, and two different family members, somebody with a zinc deficiency might accumulate excess copper that has clinical implications, and the other child or adult in the home might not. So zinc and manganese deficiency can contribute to copper levels. And the flip side, again, is that seesaw, as copper becomes elevated, zinc levels go down. So many of the symptoms that we see related to depression and ADHD are not just the consequences of elevated copper, but it's the consequences of zinc deficiency. Here, these were the headlines that some communities that in this Massachusetts study that I mentioned earlier did have a review of copper. And then I have one slide here of copper deficiency. So let's start with that seesaw again. So many of our parents and our community professionals are recommending high doses of zinc. So, we rarely ever recommend high doses of zinc, certainly over long periods of time. For someone with excess copper, we might recommend 60 to 90 milligrams of zinc for approximately 3 months before we retest and lower the zinc dosages. And because if we leave elevated zinc supplementation for long periods of time, and I've had patients and families where they've taken the zinc for 2 years without any follow-up, and sometimes it's 90 or 100 milligrams, you're going to have low copper. So we've seen this in autistic kids, we've seen this in adults, and we've seen this in children for long-term supplementation. And then when we have the high zinc supplementation, we're going to have a syndrome of low copper. And that's when we're seeing kids and adults with fatigue and depression being the most common symptoms of low copper deficiency. I rarely saw low copper many years ago, but now I see it. I see it in celiac disease. I see it in excess zinc, and I see it in other kinds of GI chronic inflammatory disorders like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis that aren't necessarily celiac disease. So when we talk about copper, we need to now kind of move into zinc. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the phthalates and the BPA and some of the kind of environmental plastics. And they are kind of neurotoxic in their own right, but most of the time or often these neurotoxins, these environmental toxins, if you will, bind zinc. So they bind zinc, and I believe one of the reasons we're seeing such an increased deficiency in zinc is these massive amounts of environmental toxins. And part of the reason I started using the words like overwhelmed with the implications really has to do with some of the pesticides and the plastics that are in our environment. So BPA and phthalates are the most common that bind to zinc and disrupt many zinc pathways, and exposure is just widespread in the U.S., infants and children being the most vulnerable as the brain is developing through our late 20s. The research has been quite clear, although not talked about a lot, that direct relationships between prenatal BPA and ADHD. Here, 292 mothers during pregnancy. Kids were all 5, and prenatal BPA associated with internalizing problems, which is the kind of anxiety and depression, as well as the externalizing behaviors, ADHD, conduct disorder, and this was both in boys and girls. There's a 2014 study, again looking at prenatal exposure with boys. There was a 27 weeks where there is pregnancy where BPA was measured, and higher BPA related to worse both internalizing and externalizing behaviors in boys in this study. And here's a 2015 study, a Spanish study, urine samples at the first and third trimester, and then looking at BPA exposure at 4 years of age, for these kids with higher incidence of hyperactivity and ADHD. So environmental research, we have a major study looking at 460 kids age 8 to 15, and pretty dramatic, higher urinary levels of BPA, 5 times higher odds of being diagnosed with ADHD. Again, 2016, 460 kids 8 to 15 years of age, 5 times the incidence of being diagnosed with ADHD. Pretty dramatic. And, I just picked a few studies. There's many, many more, both prenatal and postnatal studies looking at BPA. The clinical and environmental regulations still remain both tragically lax. And zinc deficiency is certainly one of the most common mechanisms. And the phthalates are even more dramatic. One, because they're just so common in so many consumer products. We're all aware of the plastic products, but when we talk about tiles and shower curtains and hoses and raincoats, it's really on and on from our car upholstery. We're exposed on a daily basis through air, water, and food. Dietary exposures are probably the most common. The research is also quite clear that we have disruption in many aspects of neurodevelopment, specific brain cells, hormones, and certainly concern about fertility. I don't know how many have watched, the Handmaid's Tale on Hulu, but it talks about a society where the women are no longer able to become pregnant due to gross infertility due to environmental toxins. I urge you to watch the series if you haven't, not for its environmental education, but it's just a well done, well acted series. That certainly makes you think about the infertility kind of epidemic that we've been struggling with over the past 10, 20 years. So there's many, and when we talk about phthalates, it's a complicated chemical, and there are many kinds. DEHP is kind of one of the commonly most used phthalates. It's just striking, like many environmental products or chemicals, depending on the lobby and the money and the industry. So it's banned from children's toys in the United States, but still used to soften medical device plastics. And this is certainly major part of our hospital structure, where we're going to get our care if we're ill, and wherever we turn in the hospital, we're going to have levels of DEHP. So we have the gloves, catheters, IV bags, IV tubing are really some of the dramatic kinds of exposure that we have. And this is a 2016 review. It was published in Intensive Care Medicine. And here, these are kids. In 2015, they looked at 100 healthy and almost 449 children who was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit. Ages up to 16. But here, children with DHP plasma metabolites, 118 or 150 times higher DEHP metabolites. So if you got to the PICU, which means you had lots of tubes, you had IV fluids, IV bags, the dramatic kinds of metabolites were seen, 118, 152 times higher. Again, a study last year. And then as we looked at neurocognitive functions 4 years after the PICU admission, exceeding the threshold for DHP, they were highly correlated with ADHD symptoms and impaired motor coordination. So, I mean, a dramatic study, not really optimistic or hopeful. Here's the summary for this intensive care in medical journal. Phthalate exposure explained half the attention deficit issues in these post-PICU patients. So pretty sad in our most vulnerable kinds of patients. So what do we do? Well, some of the things is not microwaving plastic food containers, avoiding the recycling number 3s and 7s, reducing the use of canned foods. Again, be careful washing some of these containers in very hot dishwashers with harsh detergents, and trying to use glass, stainless steel, porcelain for our hot foods and liquids. And again, the baby bottles and toys, many of them are already BPA and phthalate free. So let's jump to pesticides. Again, the literature is really staggering. One, how much has already been done and how little we've affected legislation or changes in the use of pesticides. Insecticides are being the most common, developed actually during World War II. And the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine esterase, enzyme that makes acetylcholine. This study in the Pediatric journal 307 kids up till age 9. Lower activity of this enzyme, 4 times greater risk for ADHD symptoms, attention and executive function, and a 6 times greater risk for memory and learning problems. Our exposure to pesticides are daily, a diet being the most common source, but air, food, dust, and soil. The American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement, demonstrating that early life exposure to the organophosphate insecticides had significant reductions in IQ and symptoms of ADHD and autism. This is our, again, American Academy of Pediatrics. A more recent study looking at a particular metabolite, the 3-PBA, measured in urinary levels of this pesticide measured in kids, and those were individuals who had detectable levels were twice as likely to have ADHD to those that weren't detected. And then even more dramatic, each 10-fold increase in urinary 3-PBA levels, 50% increase in ADHD. The insecticide and the pesticide literature, again, is extensive. Many of the early studies were done on kids of migrant farmers in California, incidents, staggering amounts of ADHD and behavior problems in these migrant workers, kids of migrant workers, and kids that are exposed to these pesticides. So what can we do? We can try as much as possible to get the USDA organic. There we at least produce without pesticides. And then the next couple of slides I have is kind of some of the 12 worst there are some crops where you need just higher amounts of pesticides, and the 12 worst are included here: strawberries, apples, nectarines, and you can read the list. I'll leave that up for a few minutes. Some believe that washing and removing the skin is helpful, but it certainly does not eliminate all the pesticides that the vegetables or fruits were exposed to. And then here, according to the FDA's Total Diet Study, there are many packaged foods that have many pesticide residues. And these were some of the highest, everything from ketchup, tomato-based products, ketchup and salsa, to bread and processed pretzels, potato chips, and frozen dinners were on the list of those that have some of the highest pesticide residues. So that was kind of the more depressing part of the kind of environmental exposures and what we can do about it. I kind of want to jump now to something that we do have somewhat more control over, and that's where there's some screens and where does TV come from. So I kind of use that as another example of an environmental toxin that we have some control over. My personal opinion is I'm not a kind of fanatic, particularly in terms of 100% elimination, because I think our culture and our kids, we just can't do that. There are communities and parents that try, but let's just take a minute. I don't have a slide, but I jotted down some of these statistics that I think are staggering. In the 70s, kids were watching TV at about 4 years of age. Okay, and today, the average 5-year-old watches 4.5 hours of TV daily. 5-year-old, 4.5 hours daily. And my pet peeve is the research with the young kids, and that's where I'd be limiting, certainly in kids 0 to 2, as much as possible. and until school age, really trying to limit screen time. Some of the other numbers, 65% of households have 3 or more TV sets, not 1, not 2, but 3 or more. And then 67% of households, of American households, watch TV regularly during dinner. Our typical U.S. teenager is spending 9 hours daily on social media, with 7.5 hours of screens for teenage girls. 7.5 hours. In 1995, it was about 3 hours. So really kind of dramatic, and certainly should be kind of frightening. In our work, looking at some of the literature with ADHD in particular, again, we have some studies that have been looked at, and what we see is a parallel between the increase in diagnosis of ADHD and the increase in the TV and screen time that we talked about. Here's one study, 77 kids, children with ADHD, watched more television, more TV, and greater involvement in these activities, and particularly less time reading and other activities. TV time obviously has a role in both family time as well as taken away from family time. These are older studies and looking at hours watched per day, and these are the early 1 to 3-year-olds and associated with attentional problems later on at age 7. .600 families, and looking at over time, 14, 16, and 22. And here you see, an hour, greater than an hour of TV at age 14. I'm sorry, these were looked at different time periods. By age 14, a risk of poor homework, negative attitude, school, poor grades, and academic failure. That was greater than 1 hour. Greater than 3 hours of TV, elevated risk of attentional problems, and least likely to receive post-secondary education. Again, more studies, 1,000 participants in New Zealand, estimated TV time, different ages, and really direct correlation between hours of TV watched with attentional problem in adolescents. And here was the summary statement. So we have, for each hour of TV, the odds of attentional problems increasing 44%, 44 times. I mean, pretty dramatic and pretty frightening. For anybody that has questions, you can please type it in, and we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. Video gaming also possibly related to attention problems. And here, concern, this was an online survey of over 23,000 adults. ADHD was positively associated with addictive behaviors. So before I end, I think just wanted to summarize my and for those clinicians where parents come in to asking me to tell their child not to use a telephone, not to watch TV, not to use the screens. We really need to think in a bigger way, one, the cultural implications as well as the peers. But there's newer research as well as some very good apps and video games that actually enhance attention. So the video screen, video game, kind of this is evil, destructive to my child's brain, has not always borne out to be true. So there's some programs now where we can kind of help kids pay attention, and there's some studies looking at some of these video games actually supporting sustained and developing that part of the brain that helps with focus and sustained attention. So it's not the evil villain that we would like to think it is. My words are clearly early onset infancy, trying to eliminate it 100%, and then monitoring. I think unlimited screen use does not make sense, both for a developing brain and for these kids who are trying to get homework done and other kinds of reading and educational things. Limiting screen time, positive reinforcements with screen time seems to make the most sense to me. 100% elimination, I have parents who just don't allow it in the home or in communities they live in, but it's often disastrous as these kids age and their peers are using social media and they're not. So I'm going to end the talk here. We talked a little bit about heavy metals, a lot on copper in our ADHD book, and certainly develop some of the pros and cons on screen.